Welcome to WAMD, the We Are Motor Driven podcast.
All right, welcome to this week's episode of the We Are Motor Driven podcast. And this is going to be an interesting conversation today. We're going to talk about car brands that no longer exist, which is growing by the year, it seems.
Sadly.
Right?
Yeah.
I just did a Google search, and now it's the quickest way these days to do anything. I'm just going to run down this list right quick. Saab, Oldsmobile, Plymouth, Pontiac, Saturn, DeLorean, Hummer, Mercury, Studebaker, AMC, Scion, Packard, DeSoto, Duesenberg, Tucker, on and on and on.
Yeah. How far back do you want to go?
Once you start hitting
REO, although they turned into Oldsmobile.
There you go. That's right. So I really want to start with GM.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start with GM because I just mentioned three GM brands: Oldsmobile, Pontiac, Saturn. Those are all GM brands.
Yeah. Then when they went through their bankruptcy, they had to shed those brands, right?
So,
Which I still don't understand some of that because Saturn was seemingly doing pretty well and was the budget brand. So if you're in a recession or nary period or you are having some trouble selling cars, maybe keep the cheap ones. I don't know.
So we can tell stories. There are movies out there about certain things like Vector Aeromotive, and I've met Gerald Weigert, and I had conversations. We can come back to that because he wanted to resurrect the brand, and I actually am a huge Vector W8 twin turbo fan. I'm one of the weirdos that loves that car.
It's a great car.
I sat inside one. I never got to drive one, but I got to sit inside one at an auto show. And
I did too.
Meet Jerry there and work with the little shifter in the door sill. And
On the left side.
On the left side, yep. You had to
Weird
climb
place
over
for a
it,
shifter.
and it was only a 3-speed.
Yes.
But he actually wanted to resurrect the brand, and he had a new model that really looked a lot like the last generation Camaro, like before they stopped Camaro for a while and came back with the more like the Bumblebee Camaros, right? And he sent me all these materials because he was hoping I knew some people. So I have
That's the funniest thing.
I know.
Those people on the fringes, and they come to you and they're like, "Oh, can you?" I mean, we could do a whole other episode
we could do a whole
that.
episode on just that. We probably should. And maybe I could post pictures of some of the stuff he sent me because it was like line CAD drawings of the new Vector and stuff. Wow. I'd love to build a modern Vector. I really would. But General Motors has always confounded my understanding as far as what they do with their car brands.
Yeah, their portfolio management has been terrible.
They've been the captains of the industry as far as rebadged.
Yeah,
You know?
and everybody does it, right?
Sure, of course.
VW, Audi,
Ford.
Some do it better than others.
Yeah,
so I would
mean,
say
but-
VW Audi does a pretty good job
VW
differentiating.
Audi does a pretty good job until you start moving from Audi up to Bentley, and you go,
Right.
that difference between the Q8 and the Bentayga is, there's obviously a lot of mechanical, but it still looks like the Bentayga still looks too much like an Audi for my
Or an
taste.
RS Q8 and the Lamborghini.
Yeah. So portfolio platform management, it really has driven a lot of this. But GM, they have no discipline in the
No.
brands. You for years you had Chevrolet as sort of the mainstream American brand.
The blue-blooded American
Then Buick was
Chevy.
your step up into
Right.
luxury. Pontiac was the performance brand supposedly.
And then explain the Corvette. Right?
Yeah.
So
Well, and when I was working on the Chevrolet advertising account, Corvette was treated as a whole separate brand.
Right.
It was its
Which it
own
deserves.
thing. But
So why call it a Chevy then,
We
right?
tried
So-
to use it as a halo over the other Chevy
Well, that's
brands.
the thing is, especially the Chevy Corvette, I can almost hear the conversation in the boardroom going, well, Chevy starts with C and Corvette starts with C, so it makes
Camaro,
more
same
sense
thing.
than Pontiac Corvette. I don't think, that you're talking about the lack of brand discipline, right?
Well, I'm going to disagree with the statement you made, Brendan. You said like Harvey's like, Corvette was treated as its own brand. You said it should be. No, it shouldn't.
No, well, it doesn't belong
That's
to
the
Chevrolet.
brand-
How does it belong with the same company that makes the Cavalier and the Bolt?
Hey,
and
there were
like-
some cool Cavaliers, and Bolt's not a bad car. So
It's
come
not
on.
a bad car, but it's not a Corvette. And now Chevy wants to make a Corvette SUV.
Look at Audi, right? Harvey brought up Audi. They've got entry-level Audis that are still luxury, upper luxury, and then higher-end luxury, and then the R8.
But then
As a halo car.
But they're all sport tuned suspensions.
Not all.
The Corvette,
Pretty
the,
much.
the
They don't have a
Corvette never
Suburban.
bothered
A3?
me as a Chevy.
They don't have a Suburban. They have a Q8.
But it's not the suspension of a Suburban. Like
Yeah.
it doesn't drive like a fat pig, you know?
Well, that's because they're Germans and they know how to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
Sorry,
brand.
Harvey.
Sorry,
no,
there,
no,
are,
no,
there
no.
are American brands that do that too.
That's fine, but the brand discipline that really blew me away when
Yeah.
I started working in advertising in the early '80s in Detroit, I was working on the Pontiac account. That was my first.
Lucky
I
you.
was working at an agency called Darcy McManus and Macius, and we had Pontiac and Cadillac as our two car accounts.
Wow.
Which was pretty cool. We
That is
also
cool.
had AC Delco and some other brands, but so I was assigned to work on Pontiac, which was cool. Even in the early '80s, I helped launch the Fiero, which started out as a really bad car, but got really good by the time.
GM's typical
then they killed it.
And they killed it. Right.
That should be their brand model.
Yeah,
We
but
make
as
a
soon as
car
it's good-
till it gets good, and then we kill it.
But what happened was, Chevrolet had the Caprice, right? And we were trying to position Pontiac as the performance division. So we were Firebird and
Pontiac is
the
excitement.
Grand Am. Yeah, we are driving excitement, right? That was the theme at the time. And then all of a sudden, they dropped this version of the Caprice on us. The Parisienne, this sort of luxuried out,
I'm sorry.
whatever.
Is that the
And it's
worst
like-
name for a car ever?
Yeah, it was terrible.
I really wish our listeners could have seen Harvey's face as he said that word. His diction was perfect and eloquent, but the facial expression was what
You
you
looked
need
like
to
he was
see.
going to throw up.
But it's just, and this was GM in general.
Right.
And I remember I went to a dinner with some folks, actually from Car and Driver. I had gone by then, but they invited me to this industry dinner. And I didn't know anybody from Adam. I'm a 22, 23-year-old kid. And I get introduced to this guy named Jim McDonald. And they say, oh, well, he runs the Cadillac brand. And I might have had a whiskey or two before this conversation. And I said to this guy, I said, you've got a real problem with Cadillac. He said, what do you mean? I said, nobody at my age aspires to drive a Cadillac. We're all looking for BMWs and Mercedes and Audis and more performance oriented. And he looked at me and said, young man, just wait until you grow up. Then you'll want a Cadillac.
Wow.
And that's what you were. He actually proved your point.
Yeah, the hubris.
Yeah.
That they had.
And well, look now though. I mean, with the CT4 and 5 and the
when they brought the V series around,
exactly.
that was targeted towards younger, and more performance-oriented
They
buyers.
had to go there. Otherwise, they were going to be a dead brand.
Exactly. Yeah.
You
Can you
know?
imagine Cadillac dying? But it was at one point in this country's history that was a very real possibility. The '80s were not kind.
Oh, no.
To
Well,
the Cadillac
and
brand.
I don't know if you remember the brand for Oldsmobile. They had the whole tagline, "This is not your father's,
Father's Oldsmobile."
Right.
Well, okay, so you've got Oldsmobile and you've got Cadillac in GM. Well, which one is your father's vehicle? You
Right.
know?
Yeah. And that's
And my dad was a
probably-
Buick guy. So.
Yeah, and those three brands at one point were really tough to differentiate.
Yeah.
And that's why, when it came to it, they had to get rid of one of them, and so Oldsmobile went instead of Buick 100% because Buick had huge sales in China.
Right. Yep.
So they
Right.
kept Buick so they could keep that market in China, which is now gone.
Now gone.
But
And let me contradict myself earlier in this podcast and say that what would have saved something like an Oldsmobile, and I think what every brand needs, is some kind of a halo car. So if Olds would have stuck with having a performance 442, if Buick, which is still here, but I think in the U.S. you pretty much put this on life support. But if they had a Wildcat, and which they were
GNX.
a GNX, something you have to have something that gives your brand excitement, even if it isn't all throughout the lineup. And that's why Chevy never let go of the Corvette.
Especially if the brand's been around that long. If you've
Correct.
got the heritage to build
Right.
on, why rebuild your whole thing? I'm so disappointed in Ford right now. They have
Yeah.
no cars.
Yeah.
Except
They-
the Mustang. When
yeah.
they had a lineup of cars, and I know everybody's buying SUVs, but that's not true around the world.
Right.
Well,
Well, the Civic still sells very well.
Yeah.
You know, so
Yeah, I mean-
so the
Good
Camry.
car.
Yeah,
Toyota
yeah.
sells a few Camrys, right?
Yeah.
And,
Just a
and
few.
I,
One or two.
I remember I was at a Corolla event, and
Yeah.
they've sold millions of 10 million Corollas, I think, in the life of that car or whatever. And them talking about, look, we still sell 140,000 of these things a year.
Here.
Yeah, that's a lot of cars.
It
and
is.
we're not giving that up. And, if someone wants to buy a Corolla Cross, they can do that. And that's the thing I think that Toyota and Honda figured out is we can use the same platform or very similar platforms and engineer them, make reasonable accommodations to keep a sedan, an SUV, and other things on the line.
And that gives an OEM the opportunity to tweak it, to continually make it better. The Volkswagen Golf, Porsche 911 are like my two favorite examples of that.
Right.
The Golf is still here, still sells thousands and thousands of cars every year. Unfortunately, the manual transmission's gone. But the Golf is still a thing. And Porsche 911, same thing. Yeah, it's a big, fat, bloated car now compared to when you park it next to that first generation Porsche 911. But the manufacturer has taken that and they keep making it better.
Or at least they try to.
In most cases, it's
Yeah.
better. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mark 8 Golf, not as good as Mark
Right,
7. But
yeah.
anyway,
We're opening up a big can of worms here.
that's a whole other conversation for another
Well,
day.
and these are all live brands. The one brand, though, that I miss probably the most is got to be Pontiac. Just, we're sons of speed. We're here, we love driving. Pontiac, as the tagline was, we are driving excitement. I always aspired to have a 77 black Trans Am with a big screaming chicken on the hood. I loved we drove. So my dad, when I was 16, or maybe I might have been 15 when he bought it, but I drove it a lot when I was 16, 17. We had a 66 Pontiac Bonneville convertible, cherry red, black interior. I used to change the spark plug sitting on the inside of the fender well. It had dual exhaust. It sounded amazing when you would just drop the hammer under a bridge,
Yeah.
It was, we used to cart around 8 people in that car comfortably. It was just so much of a heritage that we've not only just lost the brand, we've sort of lost that whole nostalgia for this stuff, but my friend's dad had a Pontiac, like an 87 Bonneville or 89, like the SSEI. I remember all the letters on the back of that
SSEI.
sucker.
That's what it was.
Nice vehicle, right? Hunter green, beautiful. My wife had a Firebird. Like my aunt moving here for the first time from Iran. She was an immigrant, and her first real car was a Bertolina, or the Firebird with the
Berlinetta.
yeah. And so she had the late 70s, Firebird. It's just that brand, though, like with the Fiero, and there were so many cars that could exist today.
Well, our age, looking at our age group, right? And Harvey's just 1 or 2 years older than us, but how many Grand Ams did we see?
Oh my
Pontiac
God.
Grand Ams
Everywhere.
were
Grand Prix.
Everywhere in Grand Prix, and then the G6.
Right.
Which is a really good, solid car.
Yeah, it was.
It was. In my mind, Pontiac did the best version of the platform
Yes,
cars.
you're right.
Right. So the 6000 STE, when that came out in
Yeah.
the early 80s, that
Yeah.
was a very credible Detroit competitor to the entry level German
Yep.
sedans
Yep.
at the time. And I remember driving that car and thinking, we're moving in the right direction here. And I know that when I was working on the Pontiac account, a guy who was working on it with me was a guy named Peter DiLorenzo. I don't know if you
Yep,
know
know
Peter.
Peter.
He runs a website called autoextremist.com. And if
Yep.
you haven't read his stuff, you should. But Peter was the senior guy on the account. And we really pitched hard to make Pontiac the American BMW.
Okay.
That was sort of our thought process, and we really tried. And there were some people in GM who got it, and Peter still calls them
Yep.
true believers.
Yep.
But there were a lot of people who weren't. At that time, GM was being run by Roger Smith and all the accountants. It wasn't run by engineers.
Bean counters.
Yeah.
Yeah, the guys like, John DeLorean and who was the father of the GTO?
Well, that was DeLorean.
That was DeLorean. Okay.
Yeah. Mhm.
So I was thinking of the right name. But the guys like that are, that used to be the ones that would get in there and design with a passion and bring out stuff that they knew people wanted to drive versus the bean counters. And, the worst kind of example of bean counters would be the Pinto bean counters that just, didn't care that a certain number of people were going to fry like a barbecue because it was going to save them a little bit of money. But yeah, not having your engineers and your car passion people at least driving the vision of what you're selling is the biggest mistake I think the car makers got into, and led to a lot of dead brands. But in my view, I mean, I don't know when Buick kind of took off in China. But in 2009, when they were
80s,
killing
right?
off,
I think so, yeah.
yeah, so that's probably what saved Buick and killed Pontiac, was simply just the Chinese market. Because in my mind, it should have been the opposite. The Pontiac should have, if one of those had to die, it would have been Pontiac. Save Pontiac, that's your performance division, and kill off Buick, which really was indistinguishable from Oldsmobile, which was kind of indistinguishable at that time from Cadillac, and and Chevrolet could have picked up
Right.
the Buick,
Yep, absolutely.
sort of
Yeah, and I think
portfolio.
what they thought they would do is shift the performance from Pontiac over to Chevrolet, and you saw some of that, but
Yeah, the Camaro was and you had the Camaro, you had the Holden brought over, which the
Yeah.
GXP, G8 GXP was a great car. You
Yep.
could have it in a manual. And
yeah,
they
the
tried to bring over
SS
that.
was phenomenal.
The SS was phenomenal. It was
good.
ugly as sin. And I'd still buy one because it's a phenomenal car.
it's a good car.
But man, could you just put a little bit of styling on that thing?
yeah.
And that's what Pontiac did so great. Look at the difference between like a 93 Trans Am and a 93 Z28. I mean, they're both the same car, but man, everybody wanted that Trans Am. It looked like the Batmobile. It was this pop-up headlights, a nice big wing on the
Big
back.
wing, yeah.
Oh,
a lot of
teeth.
plastic bits, too.
But and that was
That was Detroit.
That was the style. At the time, everybody was kind of doing the cladding. But I miss that brand. That's the one that for me, having owned several of them, having pined after even more of them, I still, if anyone wants to sell me a 77 Trans Am, 4-speed, please, black, T-tops, I'll take a 78, but, the 6.6, shaker hood, please, I'll buy it.
Okay, there's Brendan's plea for this week.
I just absolutely still want one of those things. And I know they weren't fast off the showroom floor, but man, it's just such a beautiful piece of artwork. And that's it. That's what we've kind of lost in a lot of these dead brands, is they used to be artwork. DeLorean was artwork. It was a terrible car. It was an artwork,
Well,
Well,
when
it
you're
could
starting
travel
with
through
a
time.
Renault power plant,
But one thing that GM had was there was their brands were kind of blended. There wasn't like a distinct, okay, this is this is for luxury, even though Cadillac was, but it oozed into Buick and Oldsmobile
Right.
as well.
All you
But
did was look at the badge.
yeah,
Right.
basically.
and they badge engineered badly in the 80s.
Yeah, very badly.
The
I think-
Cimarron is probably the best
if you
example
guys
of
remember
that.
the Cadillac Cimarron, and hopefully you don't.
Yeah,
Wow.
please forget it.
Oh,
Yeah, it was a
man.
Cavalier with leather seats.
Yeah,
And it
I
was-
remember somebody
and
in my high
gold
school
trim.
had a baby blue one with gold trim.
Yep.
And wow, was that thing a piece of garbage? Everybody wants to forget that car existed.
But I think Ford did a better job of that. Like you had Ford was like your entry level, everyday
Yeah.
man's car,
Your
or
Chevy,
person's car.
essentially.
Yeah, and then if you want to step up a little bit, but not much, you had the Mercury, and then if you wanted to go into like luxury, you had the Lincoln.
Lincoln,
And they were very distinct categories.
Easier with 3 than 5.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with GM is they just had too many brands.
And Ford's getting better at it too, between Ford and Lincoln these days.
Yeah, very much.
And Mercury, of course, is gone, so we don't have to worry about Mercury. Brendan, you
Yeah.
mentioned something earlier that I'd love to touch on. You said these brands need a halo car.
Yes.
Well, let's talk about Plymouth for a second.
Oh yes.
Okay,
Prowler.
so they had the Prowler, which was gonna,
Which could have been. Oh my gosh! If I could just shake whoever.
yeah, they didn't
effed
finish that car,
up,
but
because they could have been
it could have been incredible.
so incredible. Drop the 318 in there. They
Or
had the
that
5.2.
V10.
No,
You know what
they
would've been
didn't even
better?
need the V10. It just needed the 5.2 out of the.
Yep, I
the-
agree.
The Jeep Grand Cherokee
Yep.
360. They just dropped that same motor in there, put a dual exhaust on it. It didn't even have to be fast. It would have sounded appropriate.
Like a hot rod.
And then put a manual transmission in it, because everything needed, that car needed a manual, and it would have been a hot rod. Instead they put a V6 sticks in it with an auto stick,
Yep.
5-speed automatic, and it sounded like not like you were so close. You were so close.
The thing that bothered me the most about the Prowler, the doors only opened about 1/4 of the way.
So I should park next to a Prowler, is what you're saying, because they
Yeah,
can't
you
do
can
my
park
door.
next to a
You
Prowler,
won't
never
get
gonna hit
any
your door.
door dings. Yeah.
I'll tell you guys a quick side story. So the Plymouth Prowler came out, and I was pretty connected with a lot of car people at that time when that car came out. And a bunch of dealerships called me, like, do you want a Prowler? Because they were hot tickets. I bought and sold, I think, 5 Plymouth Prowlers that I never took delivery of.
Wow.
I literally, there's a whole market for flipping cars, and that was my only soiree into flipping cars was the Plymouth Prowler. I owned like 5 Prowlers for paperwork purposes, and I probably made $25,000 off of those 5 Prowlers.
Dang.
Nice.
And that helped start other ventures, whatever. But so I actually liked the Prowler because of that.
Investment
I
advice
was very,
with
very
Jennifer.
fortunate. Yeah, don't take it because that dent is the hard thing to do. But yeah, I mean, Plymouth came up with this Prowler, which looked amazing. It really looked cool. And then they didn't make it a Halo car, as Brendan mentioned. And they also built, minivans.
Yeah.
And
Well,
like Plymouth Dusters and
Yeah.
stuff like that.
You know, the problem
so
with
even a Halo car, as the point, might not be enough to save the brand.
Well, the
right?
problem with that, with a lot of these, cars, and especially the Prowler, is that you had the appearance of the thing without the essence
Right.
of the thing.
Yeah, that's a
that
good way
was
of
a
putting
hot
it.
rod redo, and you
with the
took
PT
all of the
Cruiser.
hot rod out of it.
Same with the
PT
PT
Cruiser.
Cruiser.
Chevy SSR.
Yeah, Chevy.
Which
yeah.
is a rip off of the Cruiser.
Which, by the way, when they finally put the Corvette motor in it, was actually a really cool
Yeah.
little
Oh,
truck.
and then they killed it. Why?
That
What
should
is wrong
just
with
be
you
the
people?
catchphrase for this episode.
They
and
killed
then
it.
They killed it.
And then they killed it.
But I mean, at that point too, Chrysler had huge build quality problems with
Yeah.
almost everything that was coming off the line. So even if these things look cool, they were built like crap, and
Yep.
nobody really wanted. Once you got past the novelty of it, you
Right.
realized you had something that wasn't
Wait,
any good.
this radio doesn't work.
Yeah.
Neither do my brakes.
Yeah, I have a good
There's no
friend who
steering.
I have a good friend who had an HHR and still swears every time that name is uttered.
That's another podcast episode idea.
That was like a bread
Worst
van.
cars we've ever owned.
Yeah,
The
but
HHR.
and there those. So you miss Pontiac. The one I miss is Saab.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Saab, great cars.
They,
Great
you
cars.
know,
And that's so GM bought Saab.
yeah,
And they
right?
killed it.
and killed it.
And then they killed it.
Because Saab had such a unique
Right.
history,
The
heritage
key in the middle.
Yeah,
you
I already
know,
mentioned
Also,
heritage.
airplanes.
and,
right?
it's-
So,
and they
yeah.
still build airplanes.
Right.
But,
Probably the most unique brand that's died in the last 30 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean, this is I think GM and Ford tried to do this Euro strategy.
Yep.
Remember,
Yep.
Ford owned
Ford.
Jaguar
Yep.
and
Land Rover.
Land Rover and Volvo, and they came really close to killing all of those cars. And GM the same with their bringing in Saab. The guys in Detroit, I don't think knew what they were what they had. It was funny after GM got rid of Saab and put a bullet in it. I got a call from some finance guys in New York, and they're like, "We want to buy the Saab brand and reinvigorate it.
Wow.
Will you be part of the team?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'll do that." And they were trying like hell.
how
to
often do you get an
GM
opportunity
Yeah.
to resurrect a
The
car
GM killed
brand?
that
Yeah,
too.
yeah, and
They wouldn't let it go.
They wouldn't let it go. So we had they.
Why?
I don't know if
This
it
is
was going to
mine.
work or not, but it was really fun for 6 weeks
Yeah.
to be a part of this team, trying to figure out how to put it back together. And
Well,
make
now I
it
want to
happen.
know. I want to go back in time. Let's find Doctor Who's phone booth and jump back till then, and like talk to those people at GM sternly.
What were you thinking?
Well, what they were thinking was, we don't want a competitor in the market. We're going to move.
But you didn't think it was enough of a brand to keep it alive. So
Right.
how could it compete with you?
Yeah.
These are the arguments.
Maybe
that
because in
make
the
my
back
head
of their
hurt.
head, they know that if somebody did it right, it would.
Yeah, just make them look bad.
Yeah,
I don't know if we
exactly.
would have done it right, but
What was the thing?
know.
So Saab did a thing with Subaru. They had one model that was like the Sabaru.
There's actually two. There was an
Were there
SUV,
two?
There was an SUV version.
Oh, the SUV.
And then the
Well, the
STI
SUV
or the-
was that they did at the
WRX.
end the
9.3 Aero or
7,
something, or 9.7,
yeah.
9.7. That was the same as the Saturn Vue, and
Right.
and
Yeah,
those.
that wasn't necessarily
That was the
Subaru.
GM.
Okay.
That was the GM.
That was a
one.
GM product.
Right.
Okay.
But there was the one model that was
Probably before. I don't know. That was probably before the GM takeover that they probably did a.
Okay, so
Yeah.
the true Saab that was converted to a Subaru then was the
and it was the same Boxer engine. Like,
Yeah.
And it was a really cool little car. I can't remember the model name. We could probably look it up.
The
Yeah.
only
But-
Saab I've ever driven, I was looking to buy one or a car, and that was one of the cars I drove. And the thing I remember about it was the clutch pedal travel was literally, I think, 2 inches. It was like from the floor to like full engagement, like to fully extended. It was.
That was
it
part of the character, Brendan.
Yeah.
I mean, I was like, okay, that's different, you know.
Right.
I drove a lot over the years. I drove a Saab 96, which was their old, really old. If you look it
Oh,
up,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
this
yeah, yeah.
weird rounded thing.
Yep.
It had a freewheeling transmission on it, so if you lifted the throttle, it just rolled. Huh. So it was pretty interesting. It was a
Wow.
2-stroke 4-cylinder engine.
Oh,
Okay.
2-stroke. Okay.
Which was pretty wild. That was an early 60 or 60s
yeah.
vintage car. Then I drove the Saab Sonnet, which was their
Oh,
two-door
yep.
fiberglass bodied sports coupe. A friend of mine in high school had one of those. That was a blast.
Cool.
But they, at the end, that 9.3 turbo was
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
really,
and
really
the
fun.
car we were talking about earlier is the 92X.
The Saab,
Yeah.
Saab 92X,
yeah,
which is the
the-
Subaru.
Subaru, yes.
There you go.
Yeah,
Thank
go
you,
look that one
Google.
up. Thank you,
So-
Google.
so-
Saab is a brand I miss too. I think GM got it wrong, personally.
Oh, yeah.
With the Pontiac thing, Oldsmobile, maybe some of these brands should have gone away a long time ago. But I'm frustrated because, like, now you look at BMW today, right? BMW, when I was a kid, had the 3, 5, and the 7.
Yes.
That was it.
Yeah.
An M1, which
Yeah.
is a whole different thing. Halo car.
Right.
Halo car.
And then the M division, which took the 3, 5, and the 7 and made them faster.
Yeah.
I don't think, was there a 7?
M7?
I don't think
there
No
wasn't.
M7, but
No.
yeah.
But
No.
that M5.
Yep.
Yeah.
But now they have the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
X. Add an X
X.
to each of those.
And like,
almost.
I think they just hire the Count from Sesame Street to spokesperson. One series car, 2.
And so are they diluting their brand too much?
Well,
in which case, eventually that's going to peter out, and the infamously, 357
Well,
will fade into the distance.
their naming structure is so confusing and just doesn't make any.
Oh, what shows
like,
up after the 1,
sense
2, or
at
3?
all.
Yeah.
Yeah, because before in the 80s and in early 90s,
In
like
2000s.
a 330 was a 3 Series with
Yep.
a 3.0 engine,
Right.
And
Right.
it was like, thank you.
Hence 330.
Yeah. Now it doesn't make any sense. They'll put a 340 is not a 340. Like it's
A 340M,
Yeah.
which isn't
Right.
an M car.
And then like
Yeah.
they'll have they
Sport.
introduced
Yeah.
they introduced a 4 Series to designate the 2-door version of the 3 Series.
right.
But if you put a GT at the end, then it goes back to a 4-door.
With more of
it
a-
just
yeah.
it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
I was talking to a dealer about that, and he said it's really a problem when consumers walk into the
Right.
dealership. He's like, they get paralyzed by the choice, and it almost becomes harder to put someone in the right car because they have so many choices, and it makes that process take so much longer.
I can understand how the bean counters are going to want to expand into territories that they haven't been in, right? So something smaller than a 3 Series, because now the 3 Series is bigger than a 5 Series was when I was a kid.
Right.
Right.
You know?
So
Well,
the
now
2
you gotta
Series
make
makes
something
sense.
else.
Right. But to constantly and iterate in so many different ways, again, this is where platform engineering and manufacturing technology have enabled this behavior, because now you can do it relatively affordably.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't cost you $3 billion to go from an 330i to an X330.
Yeah.
Right. That's an easier transition, but
I'm getting angry, sorry.
yeah, but there's the just because we can doesn't mean we should, and so it's. they're still selling a ton of cars.
Right.
They figured it out that they can do it profitably. They're incredibly profitable, and we'll sit here as enthusiasts and bemoan the fact that we can't get a 3 Series with a manual transmission.
Yes, we will.
But they didn't make any money on those cars. So at some point, it becomes a business decision. The question is, when do those business decisions become so short-sighted that
Right.
they pull too much out of the brand bank?
And if they need examples, GM.
What happens when the 2 Series gets bigger than a 3 Series is today?
Right.
Because they already have a 1 Series.
Yeah, that's
So you're gonna have
that's
the
going to
0.
happen.
You can have the
Just-
0 Series.
Well,
Well, you don't have the 1 Series here,
Well, right.
except for the X1.
I look at
But-
the Lexus RX when it first came out, like probably the first luxury SUV,
Right.
or at least crossover
Crossover.
SUV.
Yep. Huge sales success. too.
Huge. They couldn't make them fast enough.
Build quality was awesome.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the engine
but
And
with-
that was
amazing.
the Mercedes had
the
the,
six-cylinder.
what was it called? The ML 320?
Oh yeah, it was just
Well, let's
awesome.
talk about that
The
for a minute.
competitor to it, and that starred in Jurassic Park in
Yep.
the movie. The
Right.
Mercedes did, right?
Yeah.
So it was selling because of a movie. And I had a really good friend who was a business owner, very well off family, and they cross shopped to the Lexus with the Mercedes, and I wanted them to get the Mercedes. I hadn't driven it yet.
Yeah.
And they got the Lexus, and I drove it, and I was like, good choice.
Yeah.
Well, and actually, let's talk about that because I think you can tie the birth and growth of Lexus directly to the death of Oldsmobile.
oh,
Really?
very interesting.
Think about that.
Okay, I will.
Think about premium automotive brand that all of a sudden came into the market, launched into 2 key categories that were really important.
So they had
for
the
GM.
LS.
They had the LS, and then they had the smaller sedan,
The ES?
the ES that came out. I think.
Right. The
Yeah.
Cam-
Right
the
on-
Camry.
and then they had
after.
the SC, which was the Halo,
Right.
the coupe, the SC 400 when they
Not
launched.
the best looking car, but yeah.
The first one was good.
Yeah.
It was very
Yeah, it was
beautiful.
good.
The
Yeah,
second
yeah, that's
generation.
right. The second generation
The
was the
first
one-
generation was
yeah.
a really it was
Beautiful
a
car.
really nice car, and it was the first time that you could buy a premium car with Toyota's quality.
Right.
Right.
And then they came out with the Legend and the Vigor. The Legend, I remember.
Well, that was Acura.
I'm sorry, that's
Acura,
yeah.
Acura, right?
Yeah.
But those early luxury
Right.
Japanese brands also did something else. Is that they started putting airbag standard in their cars, and then I just remember that being a big deal for the. At
Right.
my age, coincided with the launch of those 2 brands in the U.S. And I remember people's mothers buying them, in, like a Legend, for example,
Sure.
or the SC, just because they had the airbags in them.
Yeah, no,
Or the
I-
LS.
Well, I bought a Legend because it was a 2-door coupe with a manual.
Yeah.
did
And it
have
was a
a manual.
6-cylinder, so I knew it was an Accord. It was a 2-door Honda Accord, gussied up, but it had a V6 and a manual, which made all the difference
It was
in the
such a
world.
great car.
Well,
That's why I
you-
mistook it for a Lexus, because I just
So
finally remember my friends.
1989, Lexus launched in the U.S. with the LS400 and the ES250.
Right.
Right,
But Oldsmobile
right.
didn't actually go away till 2004.
No, but
I can understand what you're saying.
I
the
imagine
decline.
if you look at this,
the sales
we can
numbers.
we could do the math at some point and see what happened there. But I bet you there's a corollary in growth of Lexus sales and decline.
Because the price point when Lexus came out wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
It was way less than BMW, Mercedes. That
Right.
was their
Right.
that was their
Oh, yeah.
selling point.
Yeah,
so they were aiming at BMW and Mercedes, and may have inadvertently also killed off
Well,
Oldsmobile.
as we talked about, I think it's that generation, our kind of generation, maybe a little bit older, that went and said, I want something different. I don't want Detroit's vision of luxury. I want something more modern, more contemporary. And I think Lexus delivered that. Plus that quality. This is,
Yeah.
again, that mistake that Detroit made. I really believe that they said, we're not going to build, when Toyota and Honda came in and kind of built these high quality small cars.
Economical, high quality
You
cars.
know,
yeah.
and the people in Detroit said, that's fine. We'll let them have, we don't make money on those cars anyway.
Yep.
We'll let Honda and Toyota have those customers. When they're ready for a real car, they'll come to us. Well, guess what?
never
When they
happened.
were ready for a real car, Lexus was there for them.
Yeah.
Right? So basically, what GM did was they said, we don't need this generation of buyers until they're ready to buy in our price point.
And by then they'd already
By
lost
then,
them.
they'd already, because this is the big thing most brands, most companies get wrong about customer demographics is people don't adopt the characteristics and attitudes of the demographic they're moving into. They bring their characteristics with them.
Okay.
I'm much younger than my dad was when he was my age.
Right.
Right?
Right.
I ride a motorcycle. I drive cars on a racetrack. My dad was sipping martinis and playing golf.
Yep.
Now I still do that, but
But he wasn't doing those other things.
right. So it's like, so the guy from Cadillac
Yep.
saying, when you're ready for, you'll
Yep.
appreciate. No, I'm never going to be that guy.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely
That
right.
guy is gone.
Yeah.
And Cadillac found out a little bit too late.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and that kind of comes back to that if GM at that time, Honda and Toyota were coming in, spent more money focused on keeping the core brands that they had,
Right.
like those core models, not brands, the core models, like BMW's 357, right? If they would have focused on those things and continually improved them, because what people realize when they're buying those economical cars, they were also reliable
right.
and
Yeah.
relatively inexpensive to maintain.
Yeah. I mean, think about what Chevy had up against the Corolla.
Yeah. I
The
don't want
Chevette.
to. I don't want to.
The Chevette.
But thank you for that nightmare.
Yeah,
I'll have
sorry.
tonight.
Yeah, now,
But
I lost my
it's-
appetite.
It's that was the thing. Toyota figured out build quality. They hired. They worked with a guy, W. Edwards Deming,
Yep.
who taught them all about quality. A guy who GM said, "No thanks, we don't need you." Literally.
This, it may sound like we're GM bashing, but they have made so many mistakes
Nope,
along
we've brought
the
up
way.
GM and Chrysler and
Yeah, I know, but no,
Ford,
but
but-
it's heart wrenching and mind boggling and honestly
No,
headache inducing just to think about all the mistakes like that. Like just no, we don't need equality. We don't need to worry
I
about these
grew
small
up in
cars.
Detroit. I love Detroit. I love GM.
Yeah.
I worked on GM brands. I worked on Pontiac, Cadillac, Chevrolet. I want them to succeed. I did
Same.
a
Ditto.
video on the Buick Encore GX,
okay.
and to me it was just they were relapsing. With that particular model, the Encore was a good, small CUV. And then they do this Encore GX and make it a little big. And all they did was they, basically took the Trailblazer, rebadged it. And in the middle of my review, I stopped and I said, I need to talk to you guys because you're making the same mistakes. Don't do this. And now when you look at what Buick is doing, I think they're doing a really nice job differentiating from Chevy.
Yes,
Right,
they
yeah,
are.
right,
I
right.
agree.
Yeah.
They're
agree.
working with the same platforms, but like VW and Audi have figured out how to
You can't, when you park them next to each other, they don't look like each other.
Right.
Right.
So it's really important. That's the important part of that, and it takes a full organization.
And
to pull that.
getting back to where I was going on the Lexus RX 300 was every generation that vehicle grew in size.
Yeah.
To the point where now it's like way, way bigger than it was back then. So what does Lexus do? It's like, oh my gosh, we don't have a car that fits in that size anymore. So they have to introduce a whole new model, the NX,
Right.
which basically is within inches of the
Yep.
original RX.
Right.
So it's funny how, and every manufacturer does this.
Yeah.
Every single
Every time
OEM.
they come up with a new version, or a new model, a new year model of that car, it's bigger in every dimension.
Yeah.
Except for maybe the Miata, but even that grew, I think.
A
Oh,
little bit, yeah.
I can fit in the current model.
I was really
Sort of.
impressed with Subaru. I just got back from driving the new Forester hybrid, and
Yeah.
that vehicle they showed such discipline.
Yep.
It is almost identical in size because their owners loved the size
Yep.
of that vehicle
Yep.
when they transitioned
And
to
they don't
this
have
more
to make a
modern
new model.
And now they don't have to come in with another model underneath it at all that cost, additional marketing expense, all of that. And their sales when they launch this new model have increased 25%, I believe.
Holy
on
cannoli.
that car because they listened to their customer,
Yep.
delivered what they wanted, didn't fall into the trap that other people do when they expand that
Yeah.
vehicle.
Right.
So, when you talk about brands that differentiate themselves, and that's the strategy for long-term survival, Subaru does a great job of it.
And,
Yeah.
and that can also be maybe due to focus groups because they might get people into a room and then and they say, oh yeah, we love the car, but if it only had a little bit more luggage space, or if
Right.
only had a little bit more back seat space, or if only had a little bit more
Yeah.
shoulder space. So they're the guys are all counting, writing notes, taking notes, and counting numbers. They're like, well, I guess we got to make it bigger.
Well,
Yeah.
it's funny because Outback has, right? The last two generations of Outback
Yep.
have
Right.
grown, but they at some point they said we can't grow this anymore.
It'll be a
and
different
that's
segment
when
then.
they went into the Ascent.
Yeah.
And they built that Ascent because they were losing families out of the brand.
Yep.
So,
Very interesting.
So fill the niche when you need to fill it.
right.
Not
but
like,
stick to your core.
I'll go back to Volkswagen with the Golf, right? And they've
Yeah.
had the Golf, the Jetta, the Passat here,
Yeah.
right? And they still have the Golf and the Jetta, the Passat. They've all gotten a little bigger, but they're still in the segment that they were born in.
I don't think
Yeah.
they have the Passat anymore. Is that still around?
Passat's still
Not in the
here?
U.S. I don't think so.
That's
And
a
then they-
Googleable
That's a
fact.
Googleable
There we go. We're gonna see
Yeah,
if
I'm
Brendan's
lamenting that
right
we
or
don't
not.
have the Phaeton anymore.
Yeah.
No, Phaeton. Cool car,
but
though.
now they've taken the Tiguan, which was kind of designed for America, which used to be a Golf or jacked up Golf,
Right.
And now it's its own platform and it's huge. My daughter drives one; she loves it. And then they had to make the Atlas, which is even bigger.
Well, there's two
Yeah.
versions
You know?
of the Atlas,
And-
and
and
I love
Atlas
that
Sport?
sport. The
Yeah.
sport one is really cool. I like that
And
a
the
lot.
Touareg went away because it was too expensive for
And no one could
American
pronounce
buyers.
it.
And yeah, that's another thing. We could have a whole
We could
show
talk
on that.
naming all day.
Yeah, that'll be a whole other
Paul,
podcast.
you had a dead brand that you want to see maybe resurrected, or talk a little about
Eagle?
Eagle.
Yeah.
Well,
So-
all of
Back up
us
the
being
talent?
former Eagle owners.
Yeah.
Except for me. Sorry.
Sorry,
Not an Eagle owner.
I do feel bad for you because you didn't get that, but yeah,
Well, it's never too late.
the Eagle was a very short-lived,
Yeah, it was.
but very to its owners. Just we love that.
Yeah, it's one of those. They took like the best of a bunch of other brands and kind of combined it all into one, and just gave some really great cars.
Yeah,
but just like everything else, I think it just ran its course. And
You know what's funny is I look at Eagle like the Pontiac of Chevy. Basically, it could have and was for a little while. That was their performance brand, but they also had Dodge. So they were kind of probably stepping on each other's toes a little bit, even though there weren't any cross cars, but the vision is a
I
little
think
Right.
what they were trying to do was because they were trying to make Jeeps sort of standalone,
Mm-hmm.
and they're like, well, we got to give some cars, right? So let's just rebadge these cars as like Eagle, and then sell it alongside with Jeep. So that was kind of
I'd probably a retail strategy
Yeah,
as much as
yeah.
anything. The thing that I think, like Dodge, they finally figured out their position, right, as the bad boy, muscle car of this generation.
And then went down to one car.
Yeah, but they had something there for a while that was really unique, and at the same time, Eagle could have played more in that European side of things,
Right.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because they're very different attitudinally.
Yeah.
100%. And that was the beautiful thing about Eagle is you kind of got this very European feel to the cars. Even I remember the Eagle Vision came out and that forward cab design, and it was
Oh, yeah.
they had it in other Chrysler brands too, but the Eagle particularly just had this look about it, like it almost had like an eagle's beak,
Yep.
but it also it for some reason to me it always just felt like a little bit of a European feel to it. And then the Talon and its cousins, but the Talon specifically was just a very like put together and well buttoned up and tight.
Right.
Like it handled, right?
Right.
It wasn't just a Challenger going down a straightaway. It was the car handled. It actually won a bunch of races. I've talked to one of their factory racers who is just they came out the gate winning stuff for Eagle, and. Yeah, it could have been so good. And what did it last to? Like maybe around 2000? I mean, it
Gosh, I don't remember.
Started in 1989 with a 90 model and
Yep.
died in around 2000.
Well, the Passat is no more.
I am
So we're
right.
in the US, Brendan is-
2022.
Yep.
Yep.
Brendan,
And
you're
then they
correct.
had the Arteon for a little while.
Yeah,
which
the Arteon,
that died
which
the
was
year
actually a nice
after.
vehicle.
Yeah,
Very
no,
nice.
I mean, again, these are cars that are born in an era when
Cars
we're
aren't-
all moving to SUVs.
That's
so.
funny because I was at a parking lot the other day and I just looked up and down the lot and there was not a car among. It was all SUVs.
Eagle
Well-
went away in 1998.
Yeah.
That
Been
early.
that long.
Yeah.
It didn't even last 9 years. I mean,
So 8 years,
1998.
pretty much.
Yeah.
8 to 9 years. Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and the SUV thing, you talk about the parking lot, that's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
Because if you're in a sedan and parked between a Suburban and a
You're not gonna find your
Explorer,
car.
you can't back out.
Yeah.
You know, you got to pray that when you start backing out, someone's going to stop.
Right.
Because you
They
got to back
never
into
do.
your spot
Yeah.
so you can pull it forward so you have better
Yeah.
field of view.
That's a good
and that
one,
cross
too.
traffic alert
That-
maybe
Yeah.
will help.
Yeah, it
Technology.
does help, but it's
We're going to talk about that on a different podcast.
Yes,
with
but the
technology.
car, you know, for people like us who love to drive and are experienced drivers and all that, it's not a big deal. But for someone who driving is something they have to do, that little bit of additional stress because you can't see.
Yeah. Yeah. What about car brands that we wouldn't mind if they disappeared? Are there any of those still out there? Oh, boy. I don't know if we should say this on the air or
I'm
not.
going to say it, Mitsubishi. Please, just go away. If you're not gonna do anything worthwhile,
Right.
Just
If
go
you're not
away.
going to bring a real Eclipse back,
Right.
You know, I mean,
or you know you get killed at the you know their Lancer Evolution, like the one good thing you had going for you, you killed it.
Yeah,
Just
you
you know
know.
what, you're dead to me.
The last
just go away.
iteration of the Lancer Evolution was at the 7.
Yeah,
was
8.
like-
No, wasn't it the 9? They got up there. I think it was beyond 7, but they were all good after.
The
at
7 was my
7+.
favorite design.
That was a great design.
I think. But oh my gosh, that was such a fun car.
yeah.
Oh, that was so cool.
I know it was so fun that they
and
killed it.
They got it to a certain point, and then they
Killed it.
They took GM's theme and just
But-
did that.
Yeah.
Who did they hire at GM?
That's a brand that definitely feels redundant in the portfolio of that Renault Mitsubishi alliance. You know,
Not in
and-
this country, at least. I know
Sure.
they sell stuff in other countries, but it's
Right.
like here, I couldn't even tell you where the nearest Mitsubishi dealer to my house is, and I haven't thought about that car in 15 years.
Well, it's so
yeah,
Yeah, it's so funny because those guys are talking about now bringing Renault to the U.S. Every once in a while, they keep throwing that flag up, and it's like, why would you do that? You're not supporting the cars you're already putting in here.
Fiat's another one. I mean,
Well, it's
at
down
least
to
the
one car.
US
it's down to
market.
one car, and it's an all electric with like 0 range, and it's got.
You know what?
It's
With the lease deal they had, I almost got one.
Okay.
Because for
It's-
$149 a month, I
it's
could
adorable.
charge. I could
Yeah.
charge that
No, it's
thing
adorable.
overnight.
We
My
did do
wife
a-
drives
Yeah.
7 miles each
Yep.
way to work. It would have been a perfect little car
it's a
for
perfect
that.
enclosed golf cart for that.
For that.
Yeah.
If they
You
had a
know,
golf cart
it
option
does
on the
have a
back to throw my
market.
clubs on, I would have
Yeah.
probably got one.
It does have a market. It's just a very small market.
I will
Yeah.
say this real quick. If you go to Italy, rent a Fiat 500. Don't get anything bigger than that, or else you will hate yourself every single moment of every single time that you are in a town and you can't get around in a normal size car. That car was made for Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not the U.S.
Not the US.
Unless you live in downtown New York.
Smart car had
Smart
that problem
car
too.
had that problem too.
Oh
Yep.
man, I would have loved a smart car or a 500 when I was in Europe last year. I absolutely I loved the car. I had a 3 Series wagon.
Mm.
Oh my, it was a great car. I hated driving that thing in Italy, especially
Oh, yeah.
Italy.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah.
And when you get into the cities, yeah, impossible.
Oh, my
but that's
God.
another episode.
Yeah.
It could be. It is.
The,
another
We're
episode.
getting all these previews of stuff. Okay.
So let's talk about Nissan. Because there was
Mm-hmm.
talks about Honda, not Hyundai, Honda,
And-
Honda, and Nissan merging. And then that was left in the dust because
And there's still talk maybe
There-
in the
there might be
background.
talk.
going
well,
on.
back room,
Nissan.
Nissan's
thought-
getting better.
Yeah,
I
they
think
are.
the products are getting much better
Yes.
than they have been.
the kicks
for
and the Rogue
a
have
few
always
years.
been good.
Yeah, and styling I think has improved. They brought
got rid
David
of the
Caldwell over from
Yeah.
Lincoln. Yeah.
You know,
I really
and
enjoy the current Pathfinder.
Right.
That's actually really solid.
Yeah, when they went away from the CVTs
When they went-
and put the
that
9
saved a lot of
speed back
things
in,
Yes.
on Nissan.
Yeah.
made a big
I heard they're
difference.
coming out with the Xterra again.
Oh,
So
they could save themselves if they do that.
If
and
they
if they
do it
kind of
right.
fix the things that you found wrong with the Z.
Yeah.
I want to call it the 300. ZX, but the Z, because I enjoyed driving that car in the limited time that I had it. I didn't have it for very long, but there are some issues that they could fix with that. And if they put a stick in the Nismo, it would be great. But the Xterra was always a really good seller for them.
Yep.
And it was kind of a halo on the off-roady, outdoorsy, part of the
Now
business.
they have Rock Creek doing that work for them, their Rock Creek edition. So it'd be interesting to see how the Xterra plays in
With
that.
the
If it goes
Pathfinder.
more towards a pure off-road, where
I
the
think
Rock
they're
Creek
going
is sort of the
after
soft
the
road.
Bronco, Wrangler, Rubicon
Right.
market.
I like
there.
that term you just used, soft road.
Yeah.
Soft road, yeah. I want Nissan to survive.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Nissan. I supported them for years
You used
in
to
the,
own one.
Z world.
Well, back in the Datsun days,
yep.
they made some phenomenal cars.
I loved the Maxima, the Ford DSC,
Yeah.
the four-door sports car.
Boy, oh boy, that was a
Right?
good car.
That was such a good car. Like, come on.
And it was, and you could get
And,
in a
and I'm
manual.
not saying I'm not yearning for that, but I think that there is a market for that. Maybe the numbers would prove me wrong, but having had sedans and big wagons right now versus SUVs, I still prefer cars.
Right. But now and you think about Nissan right now, and what do they stand for? And again, this is the thing every car brand has to do at some point, is say, what are you
mission
all about,
statement?
and who are you for?
Right.
Which person? Because the thing people get wrong about car brands is they think they're mass market brands, right? But think about it. Chevrolet was the biggest brand, and now what's their share? 15%?
Yeah.
Probably
Not even
less.
close to the
Probably
biggest.
But and nobody has
So
Chevrolet used to be 35-40% of the
Right,
market.
right.
That's a mass brand. Now, if you're 5% of the market, find those 5% that love you.
Right.
What did they want? And build cars for them and make your line all about it. Again, that's what Subaru is doing really well right now.
Right.
extremely well.
Right? And you look at some brands and they've got it nailed.
What I hear you saying, Harvey, is every manufacturer, because of the proliferation of numbers of
Yeah.
manufacturers, is a niche manufacturer, and they should be focusing on their core constituency and stop trying to be everything to everybody.
Exactly. Because and what you really do is you create what you call a brand target in your head. This is, who do I see when I close my eyes? Who do I see driving this car, right? And you can do that for BMW a little bit, right? It's someone who's
Doesn't use their turn signals.
Prick. No.
Says the only BMW owner in the room.
I can say that. I can say
Someone
it 'cause I own one.
someone who's more interested in sports car, sports driving, all that. That's your.
It used to be.
No. But think about it. That's
I
still,
have.
That's still what you see when you close your eyes.
It isn't
the
anymore.
fact that they sell all these other cars.
It honestly, Harvey, I will argue it isn't anymore. My neighbor across the street has a X1,
right.
right?
Okay, well, that's not a BMW.
It is a BMW.
But what they're
a
buying,
Mini.
what they're the
Sure,
reason
what
they-
they're aspiring to.
what
Yeah,
they
yeah, yeah.
what they're buying
The
is
ultimate driving machine.
right? Even though it's an X1, they're getting a little bit of that with the X1, which they wouldn't have gotten had they bought an Equinox.
Right.
Right. So they went for the BMW
It's like somebody
because
eating
it has
protein
that,
Cheerios because they're on a protein diet.
But
They're getting
so-
a little bit of that protein, but I totally
so
agree
you
with
close your
Harvey
eyes and
there.
you think about
And
that,
I do agree with you.
and then
Okay.
then you build cars for that person, and then you sell to anyone who walks in.
So
the
forget the
door.
Right.
conquest sales. Stop worrying about conquests.
Right.
And worry about the people who already like your brand.
Yeah, you create what we call a lighthouse brand. It's something that has a beacon that people come to.
Right.
Yep.
And when you can do that, that's when, like Apple or, BMW did for so many years. Subaru's doing now with this sort of outdoorsy set. Jeep certainly did for years and
Yep.
years. And so that's that's when brands get really strong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you can do other things.
Right.
So you have a brand target, then you have a sales target.
Sure.
So another brand I think that needs to finally, we should put it out to pasture might be Chrysler. Sad enough to
It's
say.
so sad.
Yeah. I mean,
They got what? Just the Pacifica.
Right.
That's
With
it.
one car. I mean, how do you run a brand with one car?
Dodge has one car.
Yeah.
Stellantis.
Well, Dodge has more than one vehicle.
Well, right. but
Chrysler
they
has
have
one.
one platform.
Chrysler has one vehicle
Yeah.
left.
Yeah. And that's sad for
It's
me
very sad, you
personally,
know, and
because my family used to build Chrysler.
I know, and we used to own them, and my wife's family loved them. They had
Yeah.
workers.
One of your favorite
300s.
cars
Oh,
is
yeah.
a platform from Dodge,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Which one?
Your your Hemi that you want so bad, your Cuda.
Yes, my Cuda. So
Right?
I am, yeah, and you know, I own a Ram, so I'm not crapping on Stellantis here, but the problem with Stellantis as a conglomerate is way too many brands and not enough differentiation or purpose
Or
like you were talking about.
resources,
Or-
you know,
yeah.
to support them all too. I mean, if you want
Right.
Chrysler to succeed, okay, first of all, what is it going to be?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Who's it going to serve?
Who's it going to serve? And then what does the portfolio need to be
And
successful?
they have to
Fill
understand that American buyers are different than European buyers,
Right.
which are different than Asian buyers. You know, it depends on where you are in the world. You
Yeah.
have different needs,
Yeah.
really.
I think what Lincoln did, Lincoln kind of rearranged themselves in a way that is where Chrysler could have gone,
Yes.
but Chrysler didn't.
So here's what we could have. I think Buick is redundant.
Yeah.
Okay.
For the U.S. at least.
For the U.S. I think Buick's redundant. Chevy can fill the Buick gap.
Yep.
So if you have Chevrolet and Cadillac, then you have Ford, and you have Lincoln, and you have Dodge, and you have Chrysler.
Yeah.
Right.
And then each one has a sort of entry and everyday brand and a luxury brand.
Yeah.
And
You're
that's
not
the
wrong.
American domestics.
Right.
And just be done with it.
Yeah, there are challenges with that operationally when you
course.
get into retail. You know, you've got all these dealer networks with
Yeah, what do you do with all
contracts
the
and
current
stuff.
Buick dealers?
You
and
know,
stuff
they
like
try.
that? Yeah,
So
Yeah, I understand
there are
that. And
issues, but
they built that and they have dug that grave,
Well, they
right?
didn't, yeah, exactly. They didn't cry over the Eagle dealers that all went away.
so
know?
it's interesting. It's such an interesting problem, and it's a I mean, you're talking about huge dollars.
It is.
And you're
It really
talking
is.
about long timelines in building these cars. Your bets have to be right, and when
Yeah.
they're wrong, they can kill companies.
Yep.
How about a brand nobody misses? Daihatsu.
Or I was just thinking the other day, Daewoo.
I'm sorry, who?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like,
Suzuki.
I don't even see them anymore.
No,
I mean,
yeah,
like not
Suzuki.
even like a rusted out, nothing. They're just gone.
Well, I think that's a great question for our audience. We want to thank you for tuning in again to the We Are Motor Driven podcast. If you want to see some of our videos, head to YouTube and just look up We Are Motor Driven on there. Visit the website wearemotordriven.com and you'll get Sons of Speed, you'll get Rides and Drives, you get Auto Exotica, you get the Median, you get everything under one umbrella. We do appreciate you listening today. Our question would be, what car brand do you miss most and would like to see come back? Or which car brand do you want gone?
So they can kill it.
Just when they're getting good.
And just when this podcast is getting good, let's
Kill
kill it. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.